Sewing together your 1-hour dress. Besides buying fabric, I have also bought some bias tape, some matching thread, and some buttons for decoration. If you've opted for a fabric that is not necessarily quilter's cotton, you may find it ravels a bit. In the event that it does, you get to use one of the different stitches on your sewing machine. You're going to put a zigzag around the edges of the fabric if it's something that seems to ravel. This is what the zigzag stitch looks like. I've also bought a bit of fabric that I'm going to use for making a hip belt in a different color. To do that, I'm cutting 2 wide strips that I can go and make into the belt by making a big tube. After I cut out the strips, I will zigzag these as well in order to go and prevent them from raveling. So, the first thing I do is zigzag. Next, I will sew the 2 long pieces of the belt end to end to make a longer piece. And then I press the seam open. Sew the belt pieces into a tube with the right sides together, the length of the fabric. Because the belt is so wide, I can actually go and turn it inside out simply by putting my hand in and pulling it inside out. However, if you have a narrower tube or want a narrower belt, you can easily do it by using a safety pin, by putting it on one end and gently pushing it through to the other end. Remember to press the belt flat. Pin the shoulder seams right sides together and then stitch them on the machine. Next, pin the underarm to hip seams right sides together and then stitch them on the machine. Because seam allowance on a curved seam is actually narrower than the seam itself, you have to go and clip the curved parts by going and cutting little bits into the seam allowance, but not through the seam. You stay about 1 millimeter away from the seam and you cut along the curve with these little snips so that the seam allowance, when turned in the other direction, will spread out enough so that the underarm doesn't bunch up. And so you clip them and you press them like this. Pin the side seams of the skirt, but not the tops of the side pleats, together. Stitch them on the machine. Once you have sewn up the skirt sides, you can make the extra skirt fabric into 1 box pleat or a series of pleats like I do here. Start by matching your side seam of your skirt to the side seam of the torso of the dress. Pin into place. If you want to make a single box pleat, simply take the excess fabric and make a single pleat at this spot. However, if you're doing more, you can go and tuck as many as you want, either in central position or all toward the back, on either side of that one pin. Here I'm having them go both ends into the side seam. Ultimately, what you want is a series of neat-looking pleats that lay perfectly flat against the side of the bodice or the torso portion of the dress. One of the odd things you will find is that to go and have your pleats look as though they're all pointing to the inside, you need to have the set that you are doing on the other direction from the inside look as though they're all pleating to the outside, and vice versa. So if you want your pleats to point out, you need to make them look like they're pointing in from the point of view of you when you're working on it inside out. But when you are wanting them to go in the other direction, you make them go in the opposite direction of whichever way you want it to look when it's finished. You can check to make sure that it is the way you want before you sew it by peeking at it as it is pinned rather than as it is sewn. Once you've got it very neat and flat, you can go and sew it. You're going to sew it very close to the edge. You take a small tuck starting just before the cut, maybe a millimeter, and then you gradually widen it as you are going along to be at maybe half an inch of seam allowance or less, if you can get away with it, when you get to that center point where those two seams, the side seam of the skirt and the side seam of the bodice, meet. And then they gradually goes back out from that half inch or less out to less and less and less and less till you get to the point where the cloth is no longer cut, in which case you only do about a millimeter. Very tiny tuck there, just enough so that it will hold it all in and together. It's a very small thing. Technically, it's a form of banana dart. That is to say, a section that you're cutting that starts out narrow and then gets a little bit wider and then gets narrow again, like a banana. So this is the banana dart you're going to see here, where it's taking the tuck in. You can see it's very, very narrow. You don't do any more than you need to keep all that cloth into place. So this should show you what the hip pleats look like. The smaller you can make the pleat, the less likely you will have that little sort of tuck in the front. But since there's a good chance of getting a tuck in the front, that is why I've planned on having that hip belt. That and the fact that I have a secret plan to turn the hip belt into secret pockets. While I have it on, I will also be checking the sleeves and the collar and generally deciding what I'm going to do with the sleeves. And just generally looking at all the parts to see if there's any alterations I want to try and make. You can see here a close-up of the sides because I use my remote to show you what's going on with those. There you can go and see that there is quite a tuck just caused by that little half inch, which is why it's a good idea to go and put in a hip belt if you're going to be doing this version with a little side pleat. So here I'm deciding about what to do with the sleeve, which is, since my arm is floppy, I'm going to leave that sleeve long and floppy. While I'm at it, I'm going to check the position of the belt and mark it. I'm also going to pin bias tape just about everywhere, along the hem, along the sleeves, and especially around the neck. To put on bias tape, you simply go and wrap it around the area you want it to encase, and then you pin it, and then you sew it. It is long, it is tedious, but it makes for a very nice finished edge. And so, if you have the time, it's a good thing to do. Things that really helps is if you realize which way you're going to sew on the fabric, to go and put the pins in so it's easy to pull them out as you're sewing. And while it's time-consuming to sew this, the end result is clean and neat and strong. So, here you can see I've put in the neckline, I've done the same with the arms, and I've stuck on an assortment of decorative buttons. I'm now taking the hip belt and fiddling with that. And I'm going to do something weird with the hip belt, which is I'm going to make it so that it actually has little slots in it so that I can have small pockets in the belt. And then this will, like my previous one of these dresses, because it's going to be worn to a costume convention, will have like a little bit of bunching into a thing, and then like a matching pink pin cushion stuck there so that I can grab pins while doing things at the convention. And that's pretty much it. Not a style good for my particular figure, but still something that would make a perfectly nice costume and a fairly easy beginning sewing project. So, ta-da!